Hi everyone, Acesup here for PokerNerd. Thanks for joining me again. It's the final two players in the GG Poker Super High Roller Bowl. It was a 102k buy-in. We've got Justin Bonomo and Michael Addamo, two wizards of the game, and we're reviewing their play. We just left off on this interesting hand where we wouldn't say unconventional, but deviated a little bit from GTO. But Justin Bonomo, this hand, particularly with his sizings, and Addamo did tank a little bit there with the miss straight on the river, perhaps thought about a crazy check jam, which obviously would have worked, but Justin Bonomo bluffed with the best hand and took it down, has a nice chip lead now. And would you look at what just happened? I'm not sure if this is the replayer doing this, but the button hasn't moved, and something else strange has happened. Can you see what it is? We actually have the exact two same hole cards for each player. So if you have a think about it, what's is there 1326, I believe it is, right? To 1 to get the same hole cards based on the number of combinations. But for both players to get it, that means it'd be 1.7 million to 1. So I'm not sure if I'm doing that correctly. Maybe someone can tell me in the chat if that looks right, but I'm guessing it's, 1.7 million to 1 for two players heads up to get the exact two same cards they just had in the previous hand again. I'm not saying the software's buggy. I'm not, don't accuse me of that. I'm not saying it's anything fishy going on here. Just a huge coincidence really. But yeah, let's roll with it and continue on in this clash. So we've got the King 10 off here. Bonomo on the button. Nice fat chip lead. Went for the min raise. Pretty standard with the King 10. King 8 offsuit. Just calling, of course. And these players must be thinking deja vu as well. I just had this hand. But different board. The flop is different, so that's something. Same flop as well would have been quite suspicious. That might have been a bug. So we've got the C-bet here. I think Bonomo could check or bet. Betting completely fine. On the flop with the CB, and turn again could check or bet, well, obviously he's going to value bet with the ace king queen, the fourth nuts, and obviously Addamo's going to jam now. There's so much out there, and he's got a perfect stack size for it, doesn't he? He does go for the jam, and I don't think Bonomo can really fold this against Addamo. Yeah, it does suck, but what are you going to do? You're going to have to value bet call off, I think. He's very capable of making that bluff. So not too much to say there. I think both players played it okay. And it's just the board run out that inevitably led to Addamo doubling. Notice that Addamo did raise here. This is a mistake. I would say this is the first mistake that we've actually seen. This hand should not raise. This should only be a limp. Remember, we can basically play 100% of hands. I mean, technically from a GTO perspective, 7-2 off, it's a fold. Sorry, 2-3 off and a little bit of 7-2 off. But these fringier hands, especially the 7-4 off, just limp with it. Try and get in there cheap. But Addamo did raise. Maybe he did it on purpose just to show that he's not a GTO bot. He made a purposeful mistake. No, he's probably just slightly off with his ranges here. He did CB, which is probably fine. Did have a backdoor straight and a backdoor flush, but then Bonomo ended up taking it down. Min raise here on the button by Bonomo with a 7-8 off, 10-jack calling, 8-9-9 flop, so that paired middling board, expect to see a really high frequency of c-betting, maybe 3/4 or something like that. Expect to see a fair bit of check raising with this hand. We do see, again, Addamo take that more aggressive route and check raise. Might just stop there for a moment. So with Bonomo probably betting on these types of paired flops at a really high frequency, we said sort of 3/4 of the time or maybe even more, naturally you can expect to see a fair bit of check raising since Addamo will have in a reasonable amount of 9x, of course, in his range. He'll have some of these other high equity type hands, strong draws and 8x that he might want to check raise with as well at some frequency. So he's entitled to do a fair bit of check raising. I think the main thing to take away is that he's probably going to be check raising pretty aggressively here with this type of hand, but probably check raising smallish because we will expect Bonomo to be defending quite wide in position with hands like pocket fives, ace high, king seven of diamonds, where he's got some backdoors. And that being the case, I think a small check raise flop and then barreling on a spade or heart run out, since we do block, and as you can see, it was a spade. We do block some of the continuing range the Bonomo might have, all that 10x of spades, which is, you know, definitely going to see a bet at a high frequency and then float against a check raise in position. So it gives you a little bonus, a little more fold equity, and I think we might see. Has Addamo checked a bet yet? Can't remember what he did here. Let's have a look. I think, again, I said sort of probably this hand half the time or something can check raise the flop or even more. And then on a spade, I imagine similar sort of frequency turn, a small size, and then probably on this type of run out, shoves river, just representing, you know, flushes and 9x. And then obviously incorporating some of these misdraws into that have some blocking value. We do see Addamo just check, which I'm surprised about, to be honest. If he had gone for the aggressive line, I don't think 7-8 would be able to call, since it would block, you know, some of the Jack 7, 6, 7, 5, 7 type stuff that maybe Addamo can have in his range. Although he did have a spade blocker, but I don't think that would be quite strong enough against that more polarized type of line. But as always, let's open PO and have a look. Okay, so the in position play here, Bonomo had the 8-7 off, obviously just raising most of the time, doing a little bit of limping. We have around, I think it was 30 big blind stacks, right? Is that right? Yeah, I think we started the hand with around 30, 33-ish, 35. Yep. Okay, so just curious about this flop check raising frequency and if what we spoke about was true. The out of position player here, Addamo, at this stack depth, this is a 30 big blind range I've selected. So he might have a little bit more of this stuff since we are 35, might not necessarily rip it in these higher, well, these raw equity type hands. So it's worth noting that this range might be, you know, just a little bit different with extra 5 big blinds, but I think these players are really aware of the pre-flop ranges, which makes a huge difference continuing post-flop in the way they structure their strategy. So on the flop after Addamo checks, 7-8, naturally going to bet at a high frequency, get some value and protection. And as we said, sort of 3/4 of the time, you know, just a whole lot of betting. Pocket nines blocking a lot of stuff, checking. Pocket eights, betting around half the time. Aces, which doesn't need much protection, obviously, can go for the check. You do see some of your sort of smaller pairs, tens, jacks need more protection raising. Some of the smaller pairs, betting. Smaller pairs betting. And then you got a whole lot of draws and just a little bit of nonsense sprinkled in as well. I think the main thing is probably just checking a little more of this sort of King X and Queen X, a little bit of Jack X that does have a little bit of showdown, some of your weaker Ace X. And then you can't bet all of your sort of weaker hands as well, or you'll just be c-betting too much. So mainly, I think, sort of looking for that sort of backdoor potential, perhaps a little bit more, because it gives you a little bit more equity when you have backdoor diamonds, hearts, or spades, as well as blocking some of the continuing range from your opponent. So a little more utility. But we're not seeing a big differential, are we, between clubs and non-clubs, really? But it's slight. And small bet is the way to go on the paired board, naturally. This is the size that Bonomo chose, which is good. And we do see a pretty aggressive sort of just over 20% check raising strategy here. Not too surprisingly, since we have all this 9x in our range as the player out of position here, Addamo, and a high c-betting frequency by in position. So fairly aggressive. Raising it a lot of the time, obviously not always. You do want to leave a few calls, you know, have a few strong calls as well. But by check raising quite aggressively here, you can see that the 10-jack, we said sort of half the time or a bit up of that. And that's actually, it's quite aggressive. It's like 3/4 of the time, so a bit more than I thought. Going to raise a few of these other sort of high card gut shot type hands as well. You can imagine a hand like 7-10 is good. Up and down with the 6-7 as well is good. This one would be a pretty easy one to build a range around, wouldn't it? If we pulled out the range selector power equalab like we did before. This one wouldn't really be that hard because you've got a lot of straight draws you can choose from with your jack 7, 7 10s, 10 jacks, some queen 10s. Obviously, you got your 9x, and then you're going to throw in a few sort of these backdoory, 10-4 is not a bad one, backdoor flushes. Yeah. 5-7, 6-7. A gut shot with a flush draw. Again, clubs sort of giving up a bit more, or not necessarily giving up, but not being overly aggressive with less equity. So yeah, it looks like a pretty good check raise, and it is doing the small size. So nice play by Addamo. And then we saw I think it was a small spade, right? Was it the 4 of spades? Let's have a look. 3 of spades. So that being the case, let's see if we were correct about our continuing here. And yeah, with the spade here, you can see continuing quite aggressively, and without the spade slowing down a little bit. Makes sense. If you think about the utility you get from the 10 of spades here, if you bet, you can see you actually block these hands that would have floated all this 10x here. They can't have, and all this 10x here they can't have in spades. It's not a heap of hands, but it's enough to make some difference. You can't obviously always barrel. You got to be a little bit selective. So this is sort of a tipping point, if you like. As it was though, we saw a check, but you can see that 10 jack does actually continue at a high frequency. And I think we said sort of, again, similar to the flop, sort of around half the time or a little bit upward of that. But again, it's perhaps with the spade being a little bit more aggressive than I thought. If it did bet, and let's just say we got the king of spades on the river, so not the line Addamo took, but a betting on the turn and then on the king of spades on the river. Whoa, now we see, and I was a little bit out here, I think I would have under-bluffed in this spot. We're seeing a 100% river barrel all in over pot shove with the spade. I again said sort of probably upward of half the time, but this is 100% empty the clip, go for that polarized river attack here. And that's really the objective of this hand with that small flop check raise, is setting this sort of play up where you can get maximum value with your 9x or some other strong hands or some draws like this that get there. But then other times you get to the river with 10 high or jack high. So we've got the 10 jack, we've got some queen 10 with the spade aggressive, jack queen with the spade mixed in, and then you got your 6-7 with a spade, even a few without the spades. And then you've got a whole lot of flushes for value, and of course you've still got some 9x with this line, a nice chunky amount of it. And that's GTO right there, isn't it, really? This one was pretty straightforward because of the nature of the board, where it's easy to find your strong hands, 9x and rivered flushes, and then it's easy to find your draws that wrap around the 8-9-9 that make sense. It is interesting just to note, though, that Addamo, who usually does pile on the aggression, actually slowed down on the turn and went for the check with this combo, which, it does do some of the time. And that being the case, we did see the check back with the 7-8. Nice play again by Bonomo, not surprisingly. He seems to get these spots always so accurate. And then the king of spades, we said we probably going to actually fire again polarized here around half the time. And I would have been under bluffing again, because you can see that it is just going hammer and tongs with the jack and the 10 of spades, the blocker here. It is just ripping in the double pot shove every time. And it's balanced, of course, with the 9x doing that. So it's interesting that it will check raise flop and then sometimes check a 9 on the turn to give it this potential to use these big bets on the river as well. And of course, it's going to have some flushes and sometimes check. So very capable of getting to the river in this way with a range that is still really quite mixed with a good frequency of bluffs and value. And in seeing this, you can imagine that in-game, if you are against the sort of opponent that will definitely continue to build the pot with their strong hands and fire again with 9x because they fear missing out on too much value, or conversely, a player who's tricky and likes to check raise strong hands and then check, which is probably what you see more from amateur players, I guess, and then betting aggressively with just strong hands from taggier regs that don't probably mix enough. You can obviously deviate from what you do on the later streets, whether you call more or fold more. But in this GTO world, and based on how these two guys are playing, you can see it's not so straightforward because they probably are going to mix their range quite well. Addamo may very well check some nines. He may very well check some flushes and get to the river and then go for the big overbet. And if he had have done that, it would have put, even stronger parts of Bonomo's range. If he rivered a king, you can see that he actually basically would need... Well, he does have a slither of 8x, but basically needs a flush or a 9 to call. So it probably would have worked, I dare say, but unless somehow Bonomo found a crazy hero call, he's not supposed to call with 7-8. Obviously, if he faces a smaller turn bet, he's going to continue with a 7-8. But then again, on the king of spades, facing the overpot shove, we're going to see the 7-8 fold. And the 7-8, I mean, it does block the 6-7 and the 7-10 and the Jack-7, which, you do block some flushes with a spade, but you block a lot of the straight draws that are going to bluff as well. So, yeah, against that big bet on the river, you'd rather have, in this instance, a little bit of King X calling. It's interesting that you get the ace-queen in there. Pretty high frequency. You just love to see it with the spade blocker. Not really blocking a lot of hands here that I guess the 6-7, 7-5, 7-10, Jack-7, Jack-10, Jack-7s we said not really in there, but the 10-Jack, Queen-10. Obviously, Queen-10 you do block a little bit in the Jack-Queen, but not blocking a lot of those check-raising combos, but also blocking spades makes this sort of hand actually interestingly a call, isn't it? Just based on the range versus range interaction. Again, fairly intuitive. It's interesting, like the King Jack will fold more than the Ace Queen with, well, similar, I guess. But, the King Jack now, it's blocking some of those combos we said. Even though it's a stronger hand in terms of actual hand strength to pair, the Kings and the Nines, the Jack does block some of that stuff that we said, Jack Queen, 10 Jack. Whereas the Ace Queen doesn't block quite so much because those Queen 10s and Jack Queens weren't quite as aggressive. And you still block the spades. And this is a polarized line. So by that, I mean, you expect to see sort of flushes and trips or nothing. And Ace Queen is obviously going to beat nothing. The draws, so you can flick in a call at a frequency. And I would use an RNG. I could actually see myself calling with this sort of hand at some frequency for sure. Just closing my eyes and rolling the RNG. And if it's, I'd probably be looking for like above 66 in this spot 1/3 of the time, which would be actually slightly under calling. And if I rolled an 80, I'd just click call and close my eyes and hope that I see the 10 Jack, 7, 10, 5, 6, 6, 7 sort of stuff or some other funky hand. Yeah, so I think this is one of those spots where you could definitely look to hero call with that combo. Ace King obviously is, aces, kings, queens. Well, kings is obviously the full, but queens again only sort of half the time, looking to have the spade. I think this hand is good in terms of how straightforward it is. Just to sort of, we have spent a bit of time on it, but it's sort of reinforcing those fundamental principles of what we are looking to do with GTO in terms of structuring our range, the range versus range interaction, mixing the bluffs with the value, finding those sort of more efficient bluffs. And also, interestingly, in this particular hand, it's doing a small check raise, small turn bet. Of these bet sizes, it's only using this 40% size because it wants to allow itself this overpot river shove. And if it uses a big bet on the turn, it's going to, if you think of hand planning, mess up its strategy by only having a small size, which is not going to get enough bluffs through and going to be pretty and be a fairly poor line to take. So it's really structuring its bet sizes nicely and setting up for that big polarized river bet. to put maximum pressure on and generate that fold equity. Yeah, just mixing the right combinations between value and those bluffs, of which, you know, they're easy to spot on this sort of connected board here, and then with the flush run out as well. Yep, so hopefully that was another interesting hand, and like I said, a good reinforcer for a lot of these GTO concepts. But we shall keep going now. I am a little bit surprised Addamo did not try something funky there. But there are some very funky hands coming up, so let's keep going. Better by Addamo this time. We see the limp with the 3-5 off. And Bonomo with the king 2 suited. Checks, of course. I think stabbing here is good. I like it. Got a backdoor straight and, you know, just those low cards. So we've got a good efficiency on the bluff if we can get a fold through. Maybe fold some... maybe some 10 highs, 9 highs, 8 highs. Maybe a queen high sometimes. Checking back on the turn, the 9 is a bit of a worrisome card for Addamo, but definitely a hand that we must bluff here now. We're way down in our range. Good efficiency on the bluff. We do block the 5-8. Like the sizing too. He's gone for 2/3. Does put pressure on, you know, the deuce X. Some of those, you know, small, weaker pairs, and some of those wider floats on the flop. Limp here. King 10 checks. I imagine that's okay. It might have a small 2-betting frequency, this hand. Bonomo checks back the top pair here. I think that's okay. It's worth noting he did have the backdoor clubs as well, so a bit more equity to work with if he does want to bet. Does decide to check again here, Bonomo, on the heart. Yeah, it seems okay. I mean, you could definitely bet at some frequency, I think, but you do see Pio check back a lot on these flush completing cards on the turn, especially once he's checked flop. Try to induce some bluffs. Hoping he's induced a bluff, but he's actually got that big size value bet from Addamo and had to pay it off. I imagine Addamo can use some smaller sizes as well. Maybe taper it down with some of his small flushes. Try and get paid off by some more marginal 1-pair hands. But nice big polarizing bet with that strong hand. Here we see a raise on the button with Queen 9 by Addamo. This board just smashes his range. Off 30 big blinds, or actually a little bit under that. Bonomo would be jamming, remember, lots of those raw equity hands, ace X's and pairs and so forth. So Addamo can just bet range on this flop. I think he probably checks turn. Maybe with a club he could thin value sometimes, but seems pretty standard to the river. I think this is okay. This looks okay. Wow. So what's going on here? If anyone is a bit confused what's going on here, why this hand would raise, you've got to remember the importance of linking street to street, starting with pre-flop. Now remember what a range looks like around sort of just under 30 bigs when we start this hand, is a lot of the stronger hands, ace X's, and will be 3-betting, jamming, etc. A lot of those raw equity hands, which includes tons of ace X. So essentially, you can think about it as though sort of ace X has almost been removed from Bonomo's range. Therefore, his value bets are going to be centered around Queen X. And I think Addamo recognizes that and says, well, Queen 9 is pretty high up in the range. Maybe even occasionally an 8. Somehow he has an 8X, I guess, King 8 or something. I think it's too thin, though, personally. I just do not think Queen 9 can raise here. With a club, I guess it might be okay, you know, blocking a little bit more stuff. You know, and it is a block bet by Bonomo. You know, it does look like a sort of a marginal hand, but this just must be too thin, surely, especially without a club. It just doesn't look good to me. Does anyone disagree? Yeah, I mean, it does put Bonomo in a tricky spot, though. Like, if we're thinking about, you know, based on the line taken, a lot of ace X missing out of Bonomo's range, maybe he wants to value bet Queen X. Obviously, he's going to have some flushes as well, etc. But, you know, then Bonomo, then recognizing that, maybe Addamo will start raising some of these hands for thinner value. This is sort of some next level shit going on here, isn't it? But it just has to be too thin. Maybe with a club, it's okay. But yeah, let's have a look in the solver and figure this out. Because it is a pretty wild hand. I'll be right back. Okay, so let's see it. The imposition raise by Addamo, Queen 9, naturally raising. This is what his range looks like. Remember, we're just under 30 bigs at the start of the hand. Therefore, Bonomo, and this is what we're talking about, he doesn't have a lot of ace-x. I mean, he still will have some of these suited wheels, but, you know, clubs on board. The ace was a club, wasn't it? So, therefore... Oh, no, it was... Yeah, I guess you can have the nuts sometimes. See if it'd be interesting to see if the nuts plays this way as well sometimes. But, yeah, not a lot of ace-x. So, that being the case, a huge advantage if we look at the equity for imposition, 56.4%-ish. Therefore, we're just going to see basically range betting, small size, as we said. Does use a few bigger sizes. I might have missed that in game, to be honest. Yeah, does use a few bigger sizes. Just interesting seeing, you know, some of these hands that have, you know, a club and some backdoories and are quite efficient as bluffs. You know, 4-6 wraps around the 5, throw that in with a big bet. Maybe some of your gutses. Yeah. And then obviously some ace-x strong hands. I guess the thinking is here as well is that if we have a look at the range for Bonomo, his strongest hands are actually ace. You know, other than obviously the very odd sort of queen 5 type of hand he can have, an ace 5. The ace 7, 6, and 4 are sort of his best hands based on these ranges. So that actually makes sense to use these hands if you are going to use this big betting strategy, because you not only have efficiency with your bluff and your back doors, you are also sort of blocking some of the best hands, ace 7s and 6s and 4s that are in Bonomo's range. So you get really good utility out of that big size from these hands. So it's quite interesting. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? It's very intuitive when you sort of stop and think about it. That's often the case with GTO. But yeah, mostly just betting small like he did. And yeah, he will go for a few check raises here, but low frequency, under 10%. Some of these stronger hands, queen 5 like we said, the aces, a few other funky hands, some draws. Remember, you know, you might be saying, well, why is he check raising when there's such an advantage for the imposition player? But do remember that based on that advantage, the imposition player is betting range. So you're dealing with basically 100% c-betting frequency, so you can get away with some check raising, even though you are at that sort of range disadvantage and out of position. But as it was, obviously, queen 7 calls. We saw the 8 of clubs. And a tiny bit of leading here, since again, Bonomo can have some flushes. I don't think that's a rounding error because the sim's been, you know, run down to a high accuracy and that's over 5%. I probably wouldn't worry about that. Just be checking. And we can see that queen 9, we said, yeah, that's what we said, didn't we? Not really going to value bet, but maybe with a club it probably will, and that's the case. Go for that thin value since there's a lot of ace-x missing in Bonomo's range. The players recognize that. And that's going to force Bonomo to have to reach pretty deep in his range to defend. If he does face another bet here. It's interesting that it's going for a little bit of a bigger size here. It's going for 80%. I think if we had like a 2/3-ish size in there, that might have been pretty good as well. But you can see against this big bet that the queen high, a lot of the worst queens, some 8x is going to have to continue, but not a lot of 8x. Yeah, so it is on the thin side for sure, and that's why you just want to sort of have it with a club, I think. You know, your king queen is obviously a bit more comfortable. Obviously, you can bet all your aces. You know, you might mix in a few checks here and there. It's interesting that some flushes will just call here. We'll just check call, which is nice to have those in your range on the river too. Yeah. But obviously doing a fair bit of raising too. As it was, we saw check, check. And then the river was a 4 of hearts. This is where things went a bit wild. We saw that, we said that sort of taking the ace-x out of the picture means that Bonomo is probably going to be value betting his queen-x, which he does. Therefore, he can throw in a few bluffs. He will still have a few flushes, as we saw. So some of those really wide floats that he has against a range flop bet, against a small range flop bet too, he's still going to have some of this stuff that wants to bluff. Therefore, how's he going to be able to get away with bluffing here if he doesn't bet his queens? He's going to have no bets. So he's going to have to bet his queens for value. Then he can introduce some bluffs. He's still got some of those stronger hands like the flushes we said that played this way. And interestingly, if he does bet, what do you think Queen 9 does? He does go for the block, which is reasonable. It's sort of around Queen 8 or Queen 9-ish plus. The Queen 7 down sort of does go for just this small block, which is what I thought was good and what he did. But can he really call a raise? We said that Addamo will probably raise with a club at a reasonable frequency, otherwise call. That is completely true. Not too surprising. It does have a slither of raising in there, but this just seems a bit thin to me generally, without some soul read. Yeah, Queen 8's obviously 2 pair. Queen 7, Queen 6 obviously calling. Queen 8. Queen 9 and Queen 10. Queen 10 and Queen Jack now are starting to get more sort of around where the value kicks in. So it is close by Addamo. Can't really fault him too much for going for it. It's very close, but you prefer to have a club just as a little bit of more backup so you're running into a flush less often. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just getting too thin for value, as it was after he raises against the block. Well, Queen 7 does actually call around sort of a little bit more than I thought. But you've also got to remember that Addamo's adding in like Queen 9 as extra value, which isn't really without a club. So that makes this call perhaps a little bit worse. And he might then be bluffing a little bit less as well, based on this line, which makes this call a little bit worse again. I don't want to talk about too much about going off an exploitative tangent, since we're sort of sticking to GTO majority-wise in these videos, but it's just worth mentioning. But yeah, it seems like both players played it okay, but definitely a little bit thin by Addamo, but not by too far. He was only sort of 1 or 2 notches off. And then the call, it's okay. He can fold it sometimes, but yeah, he did have the heart and the spade. So yeah, doesn't look too bad. I'm surprised he calls that often. I think calling some frequency based on how we broke down the ranges and how they interact with the absence of ace-x, but surprised it does call it quite that frequency. I may have overfolded there. I probably would have done an RNG, and if it was, I don't know, below 66 fold, and it actually should have been the other way around. So I may have overfolded a little bit on the river there. But it might not necessarily have been a bad thing. Again, just going back to what I was saying from an exploitative approach, Addamo may be a little bit underbluffing here, maybe going for thin value. He is a sick one. Definitely a sick one with his value. And he just gets away with it. He's just going to get paid off. Look at this. He just gets paid off. This hand is just, can you hear me shaking my head? Oh my, it's just, yeah. I enjoy watching it. Okay, so we see a limp here, and I'm not sure actually, is this a thing, King 8? That might be a little bit too far down to go 2-betting. I might just check that actually. Just going to bring the browser in. So we've got, we start the hand at, let's just say 30 bigs. The King 8 might be a little bit on this thin side at 30 bigs for a big blind versus a small blind call. Yeah, it is. Yeah, King 10 suited, sort of around the cutoff here. King 9, King 8, you're just checking. So that's at 30 bigs. And we are slightly over 30 bigs. I guess if we just drop down for a second and have a look at a little bit deeper, and we go down to 50, we're going to see big blind against small blind call. We do see it stretch down a little bit like this. So we're at 33 or 34 bigs. Maybe you can throw in king 10, maybe a little bit of king 9, but this is probably a little bit overly aggressive from Bonomo, but yeah. It's close though, again, isn't it? I mean, it's always close. I'm being picky here, but that's the point of the exercise, is to sort of see how close these players are modeling GTO, how close they're doing it at this top level. And you can see they are making pretty consistent small errors, but in terms of overall accuracy, still obviously amazing. Playing fantastic poker, but yeah, just not bots. They're not complete robots. This hand will call for sure, suited in position. Addamo against the 2-bet. And I imagine it will probably bet a fair bit here because we do have some pretty good backdoors. We've got backdoor straight, backdoor flush. I think it could actually fire again at some frequency here. We're going to be blocking a little bit of the king 10, ace 10 that might continue to another bet. 9-10 as well with backdoors. I'm not sure if that was in that 2-betting range though, 9-10 suited, but probably not. The 10 has a little bit of utility, but I think checking as well at a frequency, and then on the repeat jack, easy life, isn't it, for Bonomo, the way he just backs into it here. Backs into the flush, gets to go for value. I think he could probably check here because he's going to expect Addamo to stab, and well, especially the way Addamo plays, you can expect him to go for the aggressive option a lot of the time. So I think actually check and let Addamo maybe fire here with some of these types of 6-10s and 6-8s and 6-9 suiteds that have fired with the backdoors on the flop, then decided to sort of give up, but then now say I'm at the bottom of my range, I might have to bet and might even go for a big size at some frequency, especially if he thinks he can fold out a lot of those high card combinations that are going to check call from Bonomo after 2-betting pre, which there'll be numerous hands that probably do that. This specific one, I imagine, could play a number of ways post-flop. It's kind of hard to play this hand badly, I think, as long as you don't fold. I think you could see bet flop, and you could use maybe even a little bit of a larger size to put pressure on some of these limp calls that are weaker with this type of hand. But you could certainly check call with it as well. You could maybe even check raise with it. So this is what I mean when I say you could sort of do anything with this hand. And then turn, I mean, if it's check, flop, you could probably bet turn, or you could check call again. And then obviously river, you could check or bet too. So you could just do anything. You could check raise or you could just bet. I think I would like to have seen a check is probably the only thing I would change here in this hand, just based on what I said about the ranges and the way Addamo basically generally takes those more aggressive lines. Limp calling and then firing flop is going to be a lot of sort of... I think he just gets to the river with a lot more trash and feels like he might have to fire some of it. And that could benefit us by going for a check raise river. And he could still have a little bit of Jack X too, of course. We can't forget about that. He might take this line sometimes with some Jack X. And that's obviously going to be in a tricky spot against a check raise river. And, he could still have some smaller flushes. He's not going to limp call with really many better flushes, like ace with the nuts. So, he could still sometimes get there with some flushes that play this way and we get max value too. Although generally, I guess rivers stacks are going on the river anyway with flushes. But yeah, I think this hand is served better by checking. But, you could bet at some frequency on the river, but I would have checked it personally. Well, we've looked at so many hands already in PO. We may as well just do this one as well and just verify that and see that we're on the right track again with our GTO brains. I shall be right back with the solution in just a moment. Okay, team, I'm back. Let's take a look. So we've got in position with this range here. This was limp, called. And this is the range we've got ISOing for Bonomo. Remember, we said these hands weren't really in there, but we were a little bit deeper than 30 bigs, and at 50 bigs they were. It was very linear at 50 bigs, wasn't it? So I've chucked the King 8 in there just to make it a little bit easier for our purpose, as well as having the King 9 and King 10 and a few more of these offsuit stronger aces, reflective of how Bonomo might be playing a little bit past 30 bigs. Since I don't have that exact range, I only have 30 and 50 bigs, so we just compromise. Looks good. So after calling, after 2-betting, we see a betting around half the time, and not too surprisingly with the King 8, as we said, we could bet or check. Naturally, if we've got the flushes, it does prefer to bet. I Would have preferred to have seen a bet. I would have normally have bet it, and I would have gone sometimes a bit bigger too, so it's good to see that it is doing that, putting pressure on. We said, remember, that in position sort of limp calling range that still has a lot of this stuff. We could put pressure on a lot of even, 4x and 5x. Let's see if we put that big bet out there and get called, get a high card on the turn, let's say. We can, sometimes fire again and start to fold out some 4 and 5x. But I think just betting smaller is fine as well. This is the size that Bonomo went for. And not too surprisingly, like we said, some of these types of hands, a little bit of 6x, a little bit of 7x, a few other funky hands with some backdoors and high cards. So they sort of have, some backdoor equity with the flush, can make straights, block some high card stuff, as well as can maybe make top pair, mixed in with, this type of 6-10, which, after seeing a check, this is raising against a bet. Yeah, that's why I'm surprised there's not more betting here, to be honest. I was like, wait a minute, what's happening? Why is not more of this stuff betting? I think it was going to see a lot of this stuff sort of betting here. If we do think about it just for a moment, I might just bring this for Power Equalab in. You can imagine sort of on, Jack 5-4, just quickly start betting some Jack X. Obviously we don't have Jacks, but you get the idea. Probably taper it off with some of these weaker ones that aren't 2 pairs. And just keep in mind, this is after we see a check from Bonomo, how we might structure our strategy against a limp, see a 2-bet, and then see a check on a Jack 5-4 rainbow flop. And then you might bet a little bit of 5x. You might bet a little bit of 4x. Maybe sprinkle some of those in. Just some of this sort of stuff. And then beyond that, maybe a few of the pairs. Might want to bet, get some value from Bonomo's high cards and some of those weaker 2-bet ISOs that might have connected, that we still have beat though. Obviously don't want to bet big with those and only get called by better hands, but at this point we've got 22% of hands that sort of represent value, don't they? Top pair, middle pair, bottom pair. And so then, and just keep in mind, this is after we see a check from Bonomo, how we might structure our strategy against a limp, see a 2-bet, and then see a check on a Jack 5-4 rainbow flop. Now we want to look for some value, some bluffs, and well, we got a fair bit of value there based on a limp calling range. So you might start mixing in this stuff. It's going to be efficient, backdoor flushes. Yeah, some of this is a pair as well, but you get the idea. 2-3 backdoor flush. Is not in there. 4-2 is not in there. Some of these other weaker ones aren't in there. So you're probably going to use all this stuff here. And I imagine the 6-10 spades that Addamo has will bet at a reasonable frequency. Let's just say maybe half the time. And then, yeah, some of this stuff as well here. Yeah. So you can see now we're betting sort of up around, we're up 31% of hands. But this is in Power Equalab where we have 100% of hands. We're at 1/3 of all hands. So based on the fact that we only have this range here for Addamo in position, I have to pop back for a minute and have a look at the in position player's range from here and see that's 45%. So we had 1/3 of all hands, which if we say that he's only got around half of hands, just to keep it simple, we could just double it and say that we're actually betting 60% of the time. That sounds a little bit high. So maybe we want to taper off some of these bluffs here and taper off some of the, check more of the 5x and 4x, especially some of the weaker ones. We have just sort of thrown it all in there. Maybe we're betting sort of 40% or something would be better. And we could play around with it and adjust it. But again, just to go through that exercise of how you can think about it with your GTO brain and approach the hand of what you want to value bet and then what you want to throw in for bluffs based on the line and the range versus range interaction. And then you can have a look and say, okay, how did we do? Are we thinking the right way when Bonomo does check like he did? And yeah, you can see that the Jack X is betting. like we said. I mean, obviously, there's always going to be a few checks in there. But yeah, majority betting wise, we said that, the 5x betting a fair bit. Yes, lots of 5x betting. We said some 4x betting as well, especially the stronger ones. Yes, true as well. And then we said we're going to sprinkle in a lot of these sort of backdoory suited, some of these high card ones and, some of these lower ones. Actually, we might have missed some of those high card ones, but yeah, we definitely could have sprinkled up here. Yeah. And then down here with, so we got the 6-7. Interesting that the 6-8 isn't actually betting that much. 6-9, the 6-10 of spades. That's, we said around 2/3 of the time, I think. Pretty close. Or maybe we said half the time, but yeah, it's betting a fair bit with those backdoor sort of straight and flush combos. The 10 also offers a little bit of utility, remember we said, and that's also why you're seeing more of these high cards being used here, because it does increase our equity a little bit, but also block, so the sort of range that might 2-bet. We sort of is beyond 30 bigs, not so much at 30 bigs, but it does start to get more and more linear. And we do want to have it is nice to have that high card sometimes and maybe make top pair, but just also block that king, queen, ace, king, whatever, king 10, king 9, king 8, sort of stuff that does 2-bet in this simulation we run. So yeah, looks good. It is interesting that we do have these traps in here as well. I did kind of forget about those. So if we just go back to the ranges for a moment, if we just have a look at 30 big small blind call. See, we do have some of these strong hands in there. And then after calling and getting raised, we can see these traps. Is that 30 bigs though? Small blind call, BB raises, small blind strategy. So that's why we've still got, interestingly, all of this stuff here. So at 30 bigs, we've still got this actually reasonably protected range, which means that we can actually bet. And we said about half the time, and that is actually correct. I'm betting around half the time. Obviously, this is a sort of situation that could vary a lot if you're against recreational players and less experienced players. And I would say even pros would not really, maybe at this level with Addamo and Bonomo, but even a lot of other top level players, I think, might not be getting these frequencies right and have this sort of stuff in their range a lot compared to GTO. So again, it's just worth noting if you do need to deviate. In this instance, we see the check and the stab. Yep, looks fine with this hand that Addamo had. And naturally, we're going to see King 8 check call with the back doors. Tiny raising frequency in there. Remember, we said you could almost do anything with this hand as long as you don't fold it. We could c-bet, you could check raise, you could check call. C-betting being the main one, check calling being the next option, and there is a slither of raising in there. I don't think it's a rounding error because the sim is quite accurate. We did see the call, and then we had that Queen of Hearts on the turn, didn't we? And after seeing a check, we said 10-6 with the 10 has good utility. Yeah, we could fire again. I said I'd probably fire a fair bit, and GTO likes it. A lot of these lower hands, you're going to have some Jack X, obviously, that might still want to bet. You could sometimes have some of that Queen X that decided to stab that now gets there and goes for value. And you still got a lot of those draws, some flushies. Flushies checking, sometimes as well. Higher equity ones going for it. Yeah. Just got your bottom two. Still got a little bit of 5x betting and 4x, which is interesting. You still got still got a few 2 pairs in there as well. Some of those stronger hands, again, that we said you might be missing, that some pros might be missing. They might, go for the raise against the 2-bet pre, or just not have limped it at all. As it was, Addamo checked, and then I was sort of saying I generally prefer on the Jack of Hearts to see a check by Bonomo, but I imagine it does bet at some frequency. And yeah, it does bet a tiny bit, but the check is better. And it just makes sense if you think about it based on this sort of wide stab sort of check bet and then check turn, get to the river. Like we saw some jacks checking, which are going to obviously bet trips. And we're going to see a lot of these bluffs if we check now have to sort of fire like your 7/8s and that sort of thing and your 6/8s. And I think Addamo does tend to take these spots and might just fire some of this. Obviously, you know, as we said, he can have some smaller flushes. We get paid the maximum. Jack X is probably going to call if we check jam. And then you just get the extra money from all these funky bluffs or value bets that are too thin that Addamo could make as well. But yeah, would like to have seen a check by Bonomo. I wouldn't say it's a misstep though, because we do see that tiny betting frequency in there. And in this instance, he did bet it, and it was that. I think he size up or go small. I can't remember the exact sizing. But yeah, you can see flushes are, you know, pretty much jamming anyway, so you're not going to miss that much value from the flushes. But you might find jacks just call now, and like I said, you do miss out on a lot of those bluffs, unless you anticipate some sort of crazy bluffing frequency against a bet by the imposition player here, Addamo. But no reason to suspect that. So yeah, again, you know, we're seeing high level play, and that guys are playing great. But yeah, definitely could make a few adjustments, I think, to maximize a few of those things we pointed out. And yeah, just good that we got to do a little bit more of range breakdown, bring out the Power Equilab grid there, go through some of those ranges. We did miss a few of those high card combos. Just got to be careful about that. Make sure you think about when they're appropriate to use, as well as remembering that pre-flop range in this particular instance is actually quite strong for the limp call off this 30 big blind stack. Now the blinds have gone up. Stacks, you know, with 6 million, but sort of around 30 bigs now. You can see in red here. So yeah, a little bit deeper than that, but at where it starts to get linear. So King 8 suited, sort of not really a 2-bet ISO, but seems okay. And post-flop, not too bad. But another really interesting spot that we got to break down from a GTO perspective in quite a lot of detail. Again, some of those same old patterns keep reoccurring. So hopefully it's been really good reinforcement, again, this part, for all of these concepts that we're putting together. Talking a little bit about a few exploitative sort of things to look out for as well, which, you know, hopefully gets you even maximizing more beyond GTO when appropriate. Because you've got to remember that these fundamental GTO strategies that we're talking about are fantastic, but if your opponents are, especially the lower stakes, this is a great learning tool, and you can appreciate when you see players playing how much they might be deviating and, well, hey, this guy might be a fish because he's doing something really wacky, or he might be making a really high level play like we saw before with those thin value bets in the absence of the ace. And that's your job, to try and figure out what's going on, and GTO really allows you to gain more insight into the game, understand it at a deeper level, and draw those conclusions more accurately, and identify the players that might be weaker and stronger. And in the case of the weaker players, knowing how they're deviating, what they're doing wrong, and adjusting accordingly. And that's another great thing about GTO, is it also teaches you how to exploit. And so hopefully this has been another very beneficial tutorial for you guys with some takeaways. And we'll be back again with more in part 3 of this super high roller heads-up clash between Justin Bonomo and Michael Addamo. This was Acesup for Poker Nerve. Thanks for watching.